Captain America: The First Avenger is viewed by most as the worst Captain America movie. The Winter Soldier is unanimously viewed as one of the best Marvel films, period, and Civil War was such a spectacle that many fans revisit this one the most. The First Avenger is commonly rated among the middle of the pack of Marvel films, and averages a 60 to 70% from most reviewers. But Captain America: The First Avenger is my favorite Captain America film, and I think it's objectively much better than people give it credit for. So today, I'll be revisiting this movie in anticipation of Captain America: Brave New World, which comes out in a little less than a month. And I'll also be reviewing The Winter Soldier and Civil War over the next 2 weeks to celebrate the entire trilogy, so subscribe and stay tuned for that. But let's go back to where it all started, when Captain America was skinny. There is just something special about Steve in this movie, even when compared with the rest of the trilogy. Whenever I watch this movie, I feel a sense of responsibility to better myself. On the surface, I think this is because Steve is one of those heroes who does good simply to do good. He doesn't have a tragic backstory or a point to prove. He's just a regular guy who feels a duty to give back to his country and make the world a better place. And this is something to aspire to on its own, but as I've gotten older, I've realized that there was more about this specific movie that draws me to this character, and that's Steve's sense of proactivity. He gets rejected from the army multiple times, but he doesn't stop applying. When he finally gets accepted, he can't keep up with the drills, but he never gives up on himself. And even after he gets the super soldier serum, he does what he thinks is right in the face of people telling him no. And this is a theme throughout every Captain America movie, but Winter Soldier and Civil War feel more reactive to me. In Winter Soldier, Bucky shows up and quote-unquote kills Nick Fury, which forces Cap into action. In Civil War, the Sokovia Accords threaten how superheroes can function in their daily lives, which again forces Cap into action. But in The First Avenger, Steve could have sat on his butt for the rest of his life, watched TV, and worked a normal job. But because of his sense of duty and what is right, he chooses the hard path. And this hits home with me in particular because I often grapple with that sense of proactivity in my life. It's hard finding the time to make videos on top of working a 9-to-5 job while managing all the other stresses of life. It would be so much easier not to put in the extra effort, but Steve is the type of character who makes me want to be better and push that extra mile. The way Steve is proactive about his life in this movie just gets to me, and it's something that I think is further enhanced by seeing his physical evolution play out. In the later movies, Captain America is a super soldier from the start, and you kind of lose the perspective of what he once was. But in this movie, it's impossible to forget because it's depicted so clearly in front of you. And there are so many callback lines and phrases that Steve uses before and after his transformation to remind you that he's the same guy. Maybe I relate to this a little too hard because I'm an actual string bean in real life, and it's fun to see one of my own kind get to speedrun having his dreams come true, but I just love the simplicity of Steve's character. There's no complex narrative here, no gotcha moment or twist. This is just the story of a man doing the best he can. But that's enough about Steve the character. Let's talk about Red Skull, the movie's villain. I know Marvel has a villain problem, and most of their villains are throwaway characters that are meant to be somewhat dull so the main characters can shine, but I believe that Red Skull is one of the most interesting and compelling villains throughout the entire MCU. I didn't always feel this way though. I remember back in the day thinking his character design was a little ridiculous and his actions were a bit cookie cutter. He does lean in a bit to the stereotype of the villain that's over obsessed with power, that won't wait for his designs to be finished, and that ultimately ends up costing him his life. But the more I revisit this movie, the more I'm convinced that he's the perfect foil for Steve. Both of these characters were given their powers by Dr. Abraham Eskrin, but the circumstances around why they were given their powers are vastly different. Red Skull was obsessed with experimental science, and as soon as he heard that Eskrin had a formula that could make him the superior man, he took it by force. He threatened Eskrin's life and demanded to be given the formula. But as Eskrin recounts, the serum wasn't ready, and neither was the man. He says the serum amplifies what's inside of you, and I think this explains the power fantasy of Red Skull. Red Skull was hungry for domination before the serum, and thus that trait is amplified after. To me, this explains the somewhat irrational decisions he makes throughout the movie. When he and his scientist Dr. Zola are harnessing the energy of the Tesseract, at first I remember rolling my eyes when he amps up the voltage too fast, since that's such a classic bad guy thing to do. But when I've revisited this scene, I think it makes total sense for his character, and there are some more subtle moments of the scene that make it feel more intentional. I love how Zola puts on his glasses out of caution when the Tesseract is flaring, while Red Skull stares directly into the experiment. It's a great analogy for blind ambition, and when you combine that with his behavior in this scene, it becomes more explainable. And as the film progresses and Red Skull learns of Captain America, I love the hints of jealousy that Hugo Weaving adds to the performance. Steve Rogers was Dr. Eskrin's second test subject, and when Red Skull looks at Steve, he questions why he himself wasn't good enough for Dr. Eskrin. He wonders what is so good about this Steve Rogers guy, and that plays on his mind as Steve keeps beating back Red Skull's troops. I would have loved to have seen Red Skull slowly become more obsessed with killing Steve, not because Steve is foiling his plans, but because Steve is the better version of himself, and he knows it. I think that would have been the perfect full circle moment moment for both of these characters, and it would have been cool to see Steve struggle with coming face to face with what he could have ended up as. But these are just musings after having been able to think about this movie for the past 15 years, and I think what we got in the end is still spectacular. And speaking of the end, this is my favorite ending in all of the MCU. I think it's better than Thanos resting after Infinity War. I think it's better than Tony saying, "I am Iron Man." I think it's the best ending that Marvel has put to film. And none of that would have been possible without Peggy Carter. Peggy, as a love interest, adds so much heart to this film. But it almost feels dishonest just calling her a love interest, because she's so much more than that. Most of the time, regardless of the gender, love interests don't add much value to a film, and they're just there to be hot and provide a flimsy motivation for the main character. But Peggy both teaches and enables Steve to be the best version of himself. She is instrumental in his success. Without Peggy, Steve doesn't save Bucky from the first Hydra base in Austria. Her taking a chance on him by bending the rules helps Steve realize two things: that he can live up to who he's always believed he is, and that winning the war can't be done alone. He enlists a band of soldiers that he saved to carry out his final mission, and I'm convinced that this was a decision that he was only able to make after seeing the good in an organization that otherwise treated him poorly. He also helps her become the best version of herself by proving her judgment right to her superiors. Tommy Lee Jones's character was just looking for an excuse to bump Peggy down the totem pole as a foreign woman in charge of US troops, and he can't help but eat his words when Peggy's faith in Steve helped save hundreds of lives. It's easy to see Steve's impact on the story, but if Peggy were pulled out of the equation, Steve likely would have ended up on a very different path. But arguably more important than any of this is their personal connection, and I don't think I've ever rooted harder for a couple in the MCU than for Peggy and Steve. And I don't know how to analyze this objectively. They just work perfectly together. There is just something about watching the skinny guy who doesn't know how to talk to girls end up with someone 10 times out of his league, and it ultimately comes down to them having the same outlook on life. Many guys try to hit on Peggy throughout the movie, including Bucky, but Peggy's eyes are only for Steve because she respects him and he respects her. I bet Cap's new muscles don't hurt either, but I promise you it does come down to respect. It's established that Peggy and Steve are both waiting for the right partner, which shows a certain level of maturity. They're both passionate about similar lines of work, and you can tell that their dedication is legitimate because it's contrasted by so many other characters in the film treating their roles in the military with less poise. And she's also just as proactive about her life as Steve is. When the German spy shoots Dr. Eskren and steals the super soldier serum, the first non-superhuman out the door is Peggy. Again, she helps sneak Steve into his first battle, and when the time comes for the final showdown at the Hydra headquarters, Peggy is part of the front line with a weapon in hand. They parallel each other beautifully, even though their abilities to impact the world around them are different. And of course, this love story is so memorable because it is ripped away from us just when you think they might finally get to be together. These characters really tap dance around their feelings throughout the story, since Steve doesn't know how to flirt at all, and Peggy wants to keep things professional until she can't help it anymore. But just when it becomes undeniable, Cap has to make the ultimate sacrifice, and this wouldn't work if we didn't love him and Peggy together. I doubt there are many people who walk away from this movie not buying their love story, and I think that's a testament that this writing is sharper and has more layers than people give it credit for. And this brings us back to the ending, where Steve gets woken up in present day. First of all, I think it's hilarious that Steve realizes something is off because of the baseball game playing on the radio. The tension that builds after this moment is palpable, as Steve crashes through the drywall in the office doors until he pours out onto the streets of Times Square. When Nick Fury finds him and talks him down, the way Chris Evans plays Cap's response is heartbreaking. You can see the cogs moving in his head, taking in the implications of this moment. And the fact that the first thing that comes to his head are the last words he spoke to Peggy, it's just beautiful. Pair that with a cut to black and a post-credit scene for the First Avengers movie. What more could you want? This moment feels so earned, and it's a very vulnerable ending. This movie wins me over with its subtlety, not the over-the-top action scenes. But one can't deny that they are part of the movie. And most of the criticisms I see about this movie is that it's full of pointless action scenes. And I could not disagree more. Action is used sparingly in this movie, if anything. I didn't do any calculations, but I would assume that it's less than 20% of the total runtime. I suppose what people have a problem with is the type of action that's represented. You have Steve doing cool guy motorcycle stunts with explosions in the background. You have him doing flips and punching people into other dimensions. And yes, maybe it does feel a bit excessive when paired with what is essentially a character study for the rest of the movie, but I just don't mind it. These moments don't overstay their welcome. Most of the action is portrayed in montage scenes that are meant to show Steve getting more experience in the army after his first mission. The other bits of action come with very specific plot rationale, taking on 2 Hydra bases that are necessary to free Bucky and stop Red Skull. So I don't subscribe to the thought that any of this action is mindless and without reason. Another criticism that I've heard is that this movie is cheesy. There are a lot of lines that Steve says early in the movie that get brought back in the later half to make the audience go, ooh, he said that before. But in my eyes, this was done with intention, to show that Steve is still the same guy that he was when he was under 100 pounds. I'm also a sucker for a romanticized version of reality, so I don't mind a few extraneous quotes or catchphrases put in for effect. Honestly, every time I watch the movie and one of these instances comes up, I always just go, Damn, that was good. Am I a sucker? I don't know. But something about the way this story is presented strikes a chord with me, and I'll defend it to the ends of the earth. The last criticism I want to address is when people say that the humor in this movie doesn't land. And I don't know if these people are just more accustomed to how every Marvel movie is essentially a comedy at this point, but again, I have to disagree. In fact, I think the comedy in this movie is much more balanced than most Marvel movies at this point. I would say this movie mostly takes itself pretty seriously, considering it's about a guy with superpowers in an American flag-inspired costume. Jokes aren't as commonplace here as they are in the new Marvel movies, and as a result, each joke has more impact. They often contrast serious moments with a joke at the tail end to provide some levity, and most of the jokes in this movie are ones that I actually remembered afterward. My favorite is when Steve and Peggy finally kiss before he gets on the plane, and Tommy Lee Jones's character makes eye contact with Steve afterward and goes, "Well, I'm not kissing you." When Dr. Eskrin drinks Steve's booze instead of saving it for him, and when Tommy Lee Jones says he's still skinny after Steve proves his loyalty by jumping on the fake grenade. These are genuinely funny moments, and I hope I'm not in the minority of opinion when I say that. The last point I want to make is that this movie has so many iconic moments, MCU pillars that are nostalgic in some way. I just referenced the grenade scene with Steve, and to this day that scene still makes me emotional. To have little old Steve prove his superiors wrong who so desperately want him to fail with one of the most selfless acts imaginable, it gives me goosebumps. Steve's physical transformation is also an iconic moment, getting to see him fully realize his potential in his new body. And of course, this movie has the birth of the "I can do this all day" line, which went on to become a mantra for him throughout his trilogy and the Avengers films. And I don't know, man, I just love this movie. I love the other two as well, but if I'm putting one on for a rainy day, it's this one almost every time. It really does fill me with hope, and it makes me want to be a better man. It's so rare for a Marvel movie these days to move me in that kind of way, so I think it's important to remember this film and not let it fade into obscurity. But what do you think? Do you agree that this movie deserves more respect, or you just hate watching the entire time to feel something? Either way, let me know in the comments, but I really do hope there's an audience of people out there who love this movie as much as I do. Please also like and subscribe. Again, I'll be reviewing each Captain America movie leading up to Brave New World, so if you enjoyed this review, you'll probably want to hear what I have to say next. Thank you so much if you made it this far, and have a good one.